It's my honor to have had the opportunity to invite Aron to speak with us today. I've long been an admirer of his translation craft, knowledge, and productivity. He's translated works by several Turkish writers, in particular Bilge Karasu, and three books in particular: Death in Troy, The Garden of Departed Cats, which won the 2004 National Translation Award, and A Long Day's Evening, for which he was granted the NEA Literature Fellowship, and that book was shortlisted for the 2013 Penn Translation Prize. But Aron is more than a translator, which is usually the case of translators. They wear many hats, and his hat rack is full. He wears them with dignity and distinction. He's the director of the MFA program in literary translation at the University of Iowa, where he leads the translation workshop, and his areas of interest include retranslation, poetics of translation, and contemporary Turkish literature. He also was the co-planner for the Co-College Conference on Teaching Translation, Engaged Learning through Translation of World Languages, Humanities, Global and Interdisciplinary Studies. I met Aron through his tireless work in the American Literary Translators Association. He's a former president of that organization, responsible for not only expanding the association's membership, but also reaching out to and supporting younger generations of translators, diversifying the field, and giving workshops and talks nationally and internationally on such topics as translation pedagogy, translation, and global humanities. Talks such as this one he will give today. After Aron's talk, there will be time for questions and comments. So please pose your questions in the chat field, and I'll ask them for you toward the end. But before I turn the screen over to Aron, I'd like to thank Kent and Hector and Gabrielle of the Harris Institute for Hispanic and International Communication for making this symposium and this talk possible, as well as the Texas Tech University Excellence in Teaching Professorship Program and the TTU Ethics Center for their support of Aron's participation in this symposium. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us in this time of uncertainty. And I think that your interest in the themes of this conference and the conversations this symposium will allow, I hope that turns into action for future pedagogical and even philosophical changes in our institution. So without further ado, Aron, I turn it over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction, Curtis. It's really wonderful to be with you, even if it is virtually. I was very much looking forward to be in person, but reality is what it is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of walk us through several slides. I would like to sort of say a few caveats from the get-go. Nothing of the slides should come to you as a brand new, never before thought insights. Rather, these are slides to help us think about translation as a very important resource, as well as practice and discipline for the undergraduate and graduate training of students in the humanities and world languages, and obviously what now we are more broadly stating global humanities. I'm going to leave more sort of personal background details for anybody who may want to ask me afterwards why on earth I have come to where I am with my almost missionary zeal about getting translation integrated across the undergraduate curriculum. We can talk about that later on. So the first slide is sort of very quickly, can you see it now?
Yes.
So this is sort of the, a control slide, if you will, just to give us a very quick reminder of how global and local exchanges are so overlapping. And we often talk about globalization, but really it is very increasingly difficult to think about globalization in the abstract anymore, especially right now with the virus. We know what globalization really means. It means that it includes us as well. And here I have very basic bullets about globalization. I think most important here for us to understand is that the United States, any corner of the United States is in fact very much part of the globe. Now, my statistics are probably not accurate for Lubbock. I have there that you have 22% heritage speakers in the city, and my guess is that the university's population is significantly higher in terms of heritage speakers. Of many languages, I understand that there are easily 22 different languages spoken in the Lubbock community, and maybe even more. I don't know how people count these things. Likewise, in Iowa City, we have 17% who speak heritage languages, and we have about 40 to 50 different heritage languages represented in our secondary schools. So in short, we are in an environment that is very multilingual. Whether or not we invest in it or fully capitalize on it, it is there. And my point here is that we really need to sort of look closely at the kinds of advantages and opportunities an environment like this presents us in the classroom. And I'll get to that. So if we are in a multilingual community, what I mean by that is this: in any given environment, anywhere in the world, learned, educated individuals typically are competent in 4 different languages at once. Different levels of competency, of course. But we often overemphasize the distinctness of the mother tongue, and that's very political emphasis. Whereas anybody who has grown up in a multilingual environment will know that the language we speak in the house is not necessarily the national language. And in fact, overlaying that, there is also something called the regional cosmopolitan language. For example, in Eastern Europe, that's still Russian. Or in the Turkic republics, believe it or not, Turkish is vying to become the regional cosmopolitan language. And then, of course, we have the lingua franca that almost all learned citizens, who are actively shaping and perpetuating, if you will, this global society speak. And in this case, it happens to be English. So in an environment like this, we really cannot speak about the distinction of monolingualism and multilingualism, because any given individual, in our classes, I find this very interesting when we begin talking about this in the classroom. Students are fascinated to discover that they actually not only are bilingual or multilingual, but there is something called translingualism that is almost like the psychology of a multilingual individual, that in fact, these languages are constantly interacting with one another in the mind of the speaker as well. So our learners are actually linguistically ambidextrous individuals. This is in fact a great opportunity, I think, for us. By the same token, I think in the global exchange, texts, and I'm not really talking about only literary text, but any piece of information, any piece of written or uttered information, they are increasingly emerging and being experienced in a persistent state of border and actual or imagined. So it is also very hard to think about older distinctions because of the change. And we have a very vibrant exchange and interchange of styles, genres, narrative norms, the effects of which can be seen not only at the level of diction, sentence, syntax, but also in how we perceive and interpret and express or represent reality. I happen to watch this very closely in terms of the evolution of Turkish grammar. And, earlier in the 20th century, the evolution of the Turkish grammar was influenced very much by German and French. But increasingly now, the Turkish grammar is becoming closer and resembling more the English grammar. So, in fact, this global exchange is, in fact, also affecting the way we understand languages. We also have something that we are now talking about, and that is the global writer, if you will, the global creative individual, if you will, who is writing with an awareness and interest in other literatures. Here, because we have the IWP and a lot of writers come here, it is very common to hear them speak about their influences, and almost always they are more influenced by cultures that they access through internet and through translation than their own. We also have, obviously, the emergence of multilingual authors. Many of your students who are in writing courses, who are heritage speakers, they are also multilingual authors. The question that I constantly keep in mind is, what are the opportunities here if we were to see our students as multilingual authors, right? So this is not simply an abstract, highfalutin aesthetic question, but it is really something that is very relevant to our own classroom. Likewise, we have the emergence of bilingual translators and new forms of translation. Curtis, you know this as well as many of you, I'm sure, participating in this conference. We are really talking about a much more collaborative environment where translation is a social act rather than the private and isolated solitary parlor act that it used to be known as. And of course, the translation itself has grown in importance across borders. I always remind ourselves that 99% of the world news we receive come to us through translation. So here is a question that I always love to ask, and it's obviously a rhetorical question, but it's a very beautiful question, I think. How do we read a Syrian novel written in Arabic by a first-generation immigrant refugee author who cites Japanese novelist Murakami as her main influence? She read in English translation in Germany. Now, who is this writer? And of course, our paradigms have to be also modified to tackle someone like that. So the central question then is, are we ready to support global literacy? That is, certain modes and skills and methods of intelligibility, if you will, in this environment of increased interconnectedness and coexistence. And so this is sort of the undergirding question for me. What are the opportunities that critical reflection on engaged practice of translation present for undergraduate academic inquiry? Let me also say something that, again, these are not things you do not know. It's just that perhaps these are reminders for us. In the global environment, translation becomes at once the object, the conduit, and the method by which global cultures get generated, exchanged, and experienced. That is, everything that is exchanged undergoes translation. Translation itself engenders objects or material and immaterial culture. And it is also a method by which, because it is through translation across cultures that we actually understand and experience the global reality. So, with apologies for a very, very overcrowded slide, I would like to, again, these are just pneumatic devices. You don't have to, I'm gonna send this to you, Curtis, and you can distribute if you want. But This is a slide I put together to see how translation actually overlays our undergraduate general education curriculum, which is becoming increasingly focused on global humanities, our focus on liberal arts, the 5 dispositions of a liberal arts education: inquiry, reflection, integration, engagement, and creativity. And of course, for the language faculty, the 5 C's of the ACTFL 5 C's, right? And you can see, if you just look at aims of global humanities, critically engaging the other, critically evaluating and applying truth claims, reflecting on the big questions, inhabiting ambiguity, seeking and organizing and making meaning, understanding humans' relationship to their environment, cultivating ethics, mediating conflict. All of these depend on translation in the global community. So likewise, obviously, the ACTFL 5 are very much one-to-one correspondence to the global humanities aims. So what I mean by translation practice is a very broad and complex practice. It's not simply this very functional tool of interlingual transaction. It is really about what, this is a little slide that I have sort of put together based on Larry Venuti's discussions. But really, when a text is moved from one context to another, the translator imposes an interpretive inscription on this text that, in fact, is very mindful of both the source context and the target context. This is increasingly the case when languages themselves are in closer and more dynamic interaction with each other. So, and anytime we are analyzing a text that's written outside our culture and we're trying to sort of move it to our own culture, we are negotiating between linguistic structures, cultural discourses, historical context, the modal conventions in the source text, as well as the same in the target context. As a result, I think this is one of my very favorite, very beloved ethicist and hermeneutics scholar, Ricoeur. This process, in fact, carries the ambition of deprovincializing the mother tongue, which is invited to think of itself as one language among others, ultimately to see itself as the foreign. So in a sense, we are really talking about a process of transfiguration rather than translation. It's not carrying one meaning from one language to the other. And the third bullet, the work of the translator does not move from the word to the sentence, to the text, to the cultural group, but conversely, absorbing vast interpretation of the spirit of a culture, the translator comes down again from the text to the sentence to the word. So again, this transfigurative relationship. So this is usually the axis that we see. It's a very instrumental transaction axis. You know, you have the source text or utterance in the language one, and then you have the target text and utterance in language two, and the translator is a happy go-between. I'm sorry. But this is what I would like to invite us to think about. This is more what happens in the head of a translator, as well as what happens in the process of reading something in translation. That is, the translator is constantly, in fact, traversing both languages at any given time of the translation act. So much so that the translated text is not so much an equivalent text, but a text of covalence, that it carries, in fact, not only traces, but even more than that, some very deep arteries of both languages are, are found in the translated text. Now, this, I would like to insist, also happens in the minds of our multilingual students. And so, the question is, how do we make our classroom more of a friendly environment for them? So then this is the last set of slides that I want to share with you. I was worried about technical difficulties. Instead, I have a little frog in my throat, I suppose. But this is the classroom that I think translation pedagogy engenders. This is a classroom that is subjectivity centered. That is, the learner as a translator is in the center of the learning environment. And the learning is very participative, receptive, and reciprocative. Now we can open these up if you want to, but I think they are quite self-evident. What I mean by that is we are not talking about cold, static exchange of information. We are really talking about information that is created, that is discovered while being made collectively. And this is an incredibly democratic environment. Larry Venuti has an essay on pedagogy where he talks about how we set our students in foreign language classes in a state of perpetual inadequacy, week after week after week. They learn things only to learn what else they need to learn. And, and usually the instructor is sort of a conduit through which new knowledge is made available. Whereas in this pedagogy, instructor and students are co-learners, because translation, anyone who has done translation knows, is not about who knows something more, but it is about how the text wants to be known. So the translator, therefore, already, if the instructor is also acting from a position of translation and the translator, there is a decentering effect which makes the instructor and the student as co-learners. And as you know, this pedagogy is very much based on this endless cycle of create, critique, integrate, revise, reconcile. Create, critique, integrate, revise, reconcile. Because the more we do the covalent cycle, if you will, the cycle of covalence, we are in fact becoming more and more deeply invested of the text. What is so interesting is this kind of an environment also opens the person of the student to the learning act. What I mean by that is the deeper arteries of meaning, such as sound, emotion, image, idiomatic expressions, cultural metaphors, all these find more space in the classroom. And, I know that following this, a number of you will be giving presentations on translation in your own classroom. But one of the very important things that happens is that by incorporating translation in the learning environment, we're also encouraging students to think of reading and translation as actually embodied experiences rather than purely interpretive acts. When we read, we do much more than understand the words. We actually experience a sentence. So this much more embodied experience of the entire sentence is sort of what I am hoping a translation-centered pedagogy foregrounds in the classroom. the classroom becomes an expansive hermeneutic space in which meaning is not so much ascertained or resolved as it gains greater and greater valence and resonance. So we become invested in each other's meaning. Let me just take this down to the very basic level of Curtis meeting someone from Sri Lanka who doesn't, in the middle of an airport. Now, when the two people who meet in the middle of the airport and they speak to each other, of course, Curtis was a bad example because he's a native speaker of English, but let's say I am meeting someone from Sri Lanka and we're both speaking English. Now, this is like two people who are wearing straitjackets and trying to communicate with each other because we are inhabiting a borrowed space. So what happens is if our friendship deepens, if our communication deepens, what we realize is more of the time we are trying to understand better and better what we are unable to say, right? Rather than what we think we understand right away. So this business of opening the classroom to translation is also about opening it to a space of, to a very resonant space of communication where understanding can be deepened and become even more personal. So the last 4 bullets are directly from Ricoeur's Ethics of Linguistic Hospitality, as he talks it. That is, when we are translating, we are actually exploring the reaches and limits of our normative epistemology in understanding the true otherness of the other. You know, this is maybe a mouthful, but let me try to explain a little bit. When we encounter someone, we are really processing them, or when we encounter a text outside our culture, we're actually encountering them from the perspective of our own normative epistemology. We look for things that are familiar, and even things that are foreign, we want them to become intelligible to us based on what we know. Whereas for them to really become truly intelligible, we have to actually reach our limits, reach the limits of our normative epistemology so that we can open ourselves to the foreign. What prevents us from opening ourselves to the foreign is our familiarity with our normative epistemology. To foster narrative plurality, diversity, I mean, one of the most crucial experiences that led me to think about these topics was a workshop I conducted between among 3 groups of high school students. One group coming from Armenia, another group from Turkey, and another from the United States. And it was so wonderful because we were not allowed to talk about the Armenian conflict or the Armenian genocide. This was sort of a no-no. But what we did is we put them in groups so that they could talk and work together on literary texts of importance to them. And in this collaboration, they were able to experience the diversity and plurality of truth claims. And much more importantly, they were able to transcend beyond their normative epistemologies, if you will, concerning those truth claims. And they were wonderful. By the end of these 3 weeks, they actually had changed dramatically. I love, though, this word transfigurability, because it is not about me changing the other or the other changing me, which is sort of the standard pedagogy, if you will, but this is in fact both interlocutors changing in the process of this translation, where in fact the agent of change and the subject that is changing are almost inseparable. So this, of course, is what Ricoeur thinks that linguistic hospitality is also about, an environment where we seek reconciliation and embrace mutuality and coexistence, rather than just tolerance or accommodation. These are, again, values that are much more social and collective in character. Okay, so this is it. I'm now open for, I don't know what happened. I don't know how it got out there to you, but this is it. So I'm here.
I mean, it got out there to us, of course, and thank you, Aron. This is fantastic. And of course, people can raise their hands, or if they want to add something to the chat, I can read it off. But please, feel free to offer any comments or questions that you have. Yeah, so Kent is saying to post the questions there. I think, that term, Ricoeur's term, linguistic hospitality, is one that I think can be key for us as we're considering, how do we function as teachers, as colleagues, as researchers in a Hispanic serving institution, right? Oftentimes, it seems like we're considering, well, how can I help that person kind of arrive at where I am or where they need to go, rather than considering, let's meet on some common terms and let's figure out how we can be growing, doing these things together, right? So that seems to be, that might be a really good jumping off point for some of us. And I see that, we've got people from the different areas, from different colleges, and as well as departments. So I don't know if anyone's got a question for Aron. Nothing yet. Well, I've got, go ahead, Kent.
Yeah, this may be jumping ahead a little bit, and I really appreciate what you were saying about these acts, and actually the model you showed there of sort of the equivalence versus covalence looks very much like some of our very traditional models in communication of source, message, channel, receiver, where it's this very linear process and sort of not enough recognition given to feedback, and how the receivers, or the second person in the dyad's response, whether it's nonverbal, verbal, whatever, is influencing the way that the message is encoded to begin with. And there's been a movement in a very similar way to what you're saying in terms of communication theory to try to capture a lot more of the nuance and the exchanges that's going on. And so my question is related. I'm just curious, as somebody who studies media, how you see this sort of equivalence versus covalence in terms of media texts, where it's not just the written word on the page, but you've got a lot going on in terms of the nonverbal communication, the verbal communication. If there's some kind of intermediary who's doing a voiceover or conducting an interview, it seems like there's more complexity. I felt like my brain was going to explode when I was thinking about the complexity of what you're talking about in terms of, literary translation, and you start adding, sort of these other elements. I'm just curious what your response to that might be.
Well, I mean, for one, what I was trying to share with you is, in fact, sort of the intellectual groundwork of work that really needs to happen patiently and in a very widespread manner, namely bringing translation into the academy in a systematic, intentional manner, and creating coursework and fanatic programs. I mean, if you believe it or not, there is only one BS program in translation in this country, freestanding BS program in translation in this country, Kent State. And we are about to start the first BA in translation, freestanding. There are translation tracts, there are translation certificates, there are all sorts of translation curriculum, but whereas in the rest of the world, students learn translation from undergraduate first year onward. Many of you who are from other parts of the world, I see a lot of you who have come from other countries or who are familiar with other countries will know that what I'm saying. I work with a Ukrainian university in Lviv very closely. They have a 4-year program where they have 450 students. There are 450 majors. And they have a program of 120 credit hours in translation and attending disciplines, linguistics and philosophy and sociology and so on and so forth. So we have really neglected this area greatly. So that's one reason why perhaps these slides come across as complex, because very little of those slides can be done in one course. But again, it's about steadily building an awareness of translation, but also steadily employing this translation pedagogy, both in translation courses as well as in literature courses, writing courses, language courses, and whatnot. In terms of media, we have, for example, a news media analysis assignment in a course we put together. It's an undergraduate course. It's a general education course called Translation and Global Society. And we ask students to identify a global topic and then follow 5 different news sources for 15 days. Those of you who are in media studies know that this is a basic media analysis exercise. But what we do is we tell them that one of the sources has to be Midwest, one of the sources has to be national US, and then at least 2 sources have to be from Europe and the and a source language that they can speak, right? They can read. And they then look at how, in fact, the media also translates, not just translates meaning from one language to the other, but there is another cultural translation that happens when students come to discover that these cultural concerns are actually processed and interpreted and utilized, if you will, very differently. I mean, this is happening right now with the coronavirus, right? Each country's take on this is very, very interesting. Every day I read Turkish newspapers, and it's a very different narrative there than it is here. So again, the goal is to make our students more and more aware, because the space that we create in the classroom is, no matter how egalitarian we try to be, is still us-centered. To make it really a translational space, we have to actually absent ourselves. Maybe we have to become more invisible, Curtis, to use our own term, right? We have to become more invisible and let the students, in fact, negotiate meaning among them. I was always shocked whenever I would ask students in the classroom, why were you quiet? And they would say, oh, that discussion infuriated me so, or I was so offended by something. Well, here we are, 50 minutes, this person has sat there and processed all of this information through the filter of their discontent. We went our merry way and taught, it was in fact Euripides' Medea. And, you know, we did a fairly good job of it, but that student just was present in a way that we did not acknowledge. So a little bit of that also happens in our classes where we have especially heritage speakers who bring into the classroom a sense of inadequacy, a sense of sort of subordination. And that has to be really, I think, tackled head on. I don't know if I'm answering your questions, but these are my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, of course, for me, I mean, that's bringing up a number of other things, but I want to step back to something that you were saying before about the different programs. And you and I have spoken in the past about how you kind of came into, or who you were speaking with at the University of Iowa in order to create this program in literary translation. Could you talk a little bit about that process and also about, I guess, just some considerations that you had to have in order to introduce not only the graduate, but perhaps more importantly, the undergraduate track and program?
Well, the graduate track was there for years, right? And in fact, the translation workshop itself was introduced at Iowa. So it has like 50 some years of history there. So shortly before I came to Iowa, a very interesting thing happened, and that is the translation program lost its home when comparative literature and cinema, as that was a one department, was disaggregated. And all of a sudden they found this translation program and they said, what do we do with it? And they just said, well, let's just put it in the division of languages and literatures and cultures, which to me was fantastic because, you know, although the division did not welcome us in the most open arms manner because, you know, there's always a tension between translation and world language instruction because, you know, there's this question of how immersive is translation. But in any case, the people that I immediately worked to persuade were my division language colleagues. And that was very important. But the most significant ally I had in the process were the students. We put together this very, very modest little minor called Translation for Global Literacy. Students have to complete 18 credit hours, and 6 of these credit hours can count toward their own major. So we're really talking about 4 courses that they need to take. And lo and behold, it just exploded. Right now, we have 50 students. Every year we have about 50 active students in this minor. This is a very large number for us. It may not be for you, but it is large for us. And in the span of 3 years, well, the program is 4 years old. So conceivably, we have been producing graduates in the last 2 years. at most third, if we sort of brought people whose courses somewhat counted. So we have had 31 students who graduate with this program already, with this minor. So this was the most compelling argument for our language programs, because I don't know how it is with you, but language programs are suffering in the Midwest, and definitely at Iowa as well. And students are in fact gravitating toward translation, in part because they are very functional in their sense. I mean, they are very pragmatic. They want to sort of learn language to use it. And I don't know what's wrong with that. You know, we always make this into a big deal that you know, they want to use it. And this is a very common place for language use. Forbes came out with a study, in fact, that showed that there will be a 16% growth in this field of language mediation in the next, 5 to 10 years. And so the students are very excited. And once that excitement became known, faculty have become more and more interested and invested. We have, of course, several courses in the Spanish program that already do translation. And so now we are working toward, as I said, the college approved it, but right now, of course, the approval process came to a halt because of the coronavirus. But you know, the college approved this BA, and we're hoping to roll it out in the next year or two.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. It's really helpful because, you know, just thinking of how we're trying to do something similar, you know, number of interested bodies here, in particular, in this particular gathering, you know, from classical and modern languages, from English, media and communication, and then there's interest around, you know, from other colleges around the campus as well.
And how many different disciplines are represented in this group we have here?
Jorge Ramirez has a question if we give him a chance.
Yeah.
Yes, hi. I know we're close to the end, Dr. Aji. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I'm sorry that I joined you late. I was having virtual office hours, but I'm at the law school and I've had a great opportunity to teach in different countries around the world, China, Lithuania, Brazil, Bolivia. But one of the experiences that I had in Lithuania was, you know, very Catholic country, taught a group not just of Lithuanians, but also international students from throughout Europe, Spain, Italy, Ukraine. But during it's somewhat of a political course. The title of the course is International Trade in the Era of Trump. So one of the things I talk about is that Trump is a very transactional president. And at one point I talked about the fact that you know, he had tried to remove transgendered individuals from the military. And of course, there was a lot of silence in the room. One is that the Lithuanians are very Catholic. They're not very familiar with this situation. And there was a lot of silence. One student finally spoke up, very anti-transgendered. And I basically said to the rest of the class, is there anybody who wants to argue the other side? There was almost no one who wanted to argue the other side. Finally, I think she was either from Spain or Italy, a woman started defending the situation, but then the Lithuanians all attacked her. And so the question is, how do you defend as the professor in that situation? How do you stand up to defend someone like that? What do you do when you've got all these different cultural aspects and you have your own point of view as well involved in a situation like that? How do you balance it?
Well, I mean, absolutely. This is, in fact, teaching to the conflict multiplied by 10 times, right? We used to have that pedagogy, conflict-centered teaching. This becomes almost more than that. But again, this is why we need to approach the classroom and our courses less in terms of the topics and competencies we want to create, or we want to encourage, but more in terms of the community we want to create. And this is not just a little, rosy glass Pollyanna. It's about, in fact, from day one, working to create an environment where difference is not just accommodated or defended or argued, but it is experienced as a matter of necessity of being a collective, right? I mean, we do this in other places. I mean, not to divulge too much, but I don't think I will be saying anything that many of you have not experienced. I mean, how many marriages would not go more than 2 days if we didn't do this, right? I mean, accepting difference as a matter of necessity and then working with it is the kind of, it's about building empathy. It's an empathy-centered pedagogy. So, this in fact happened also in other parts of the world. When as I said, I go and work with the Ivan Franko National University in Lviv, Ukraine. There too, they are very, very religious. And now on top of it, they are very nationalist. Interestingly, they are left-wing nationalists because they are very progressive, but there is also now this great strain of nationalism because of the Russian aggression. So the question is, if these ideas are already present in the minds of the students, they are already the filters through which they are processing knowledge. So what is it that we need to do to make that space more open? I would actually, when somebody makes a very provocative statement that others are unwilling to follow, before turning to the others, I actually ask the person to speak a little more about the idea, because oftentimes the ideas, when elaborated further in respectful and thoughtful manner, not repeated, but elaborated further, become less hostile, and giving the opposition, if you will, space, also empowers the silent to think that you will do the same with them if they start saying things. One of my points of pride is many times my students don't know what my political affiliation is. Not because I don't have it, but because I want them to have their own and to be able to sort of articulate. I don't know if that helps, but it's, again, I slow down my classes a lot. I mean, I'm sorry, maybe the assessment police will come after me, but I slow down my classes a lot. Our students forget all the fact-based information they get out of us in the span of maybe 5 years. What they remember are the dispositions, problem solving, empathy. And so to create that space is very important to me, and maybe because of my own background,